kind of really discount the countries that contributed, but maybe they weren't like, they were occupied throughout the war.
But I'd apply that also to Commonwealth countries too, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
I think we overlook the massive contribution from the Anzac forces.
At the time, you could still count the UK as a superpower. America was a rising superpower.
Those were the days.
Sleeping giant kind of wakes up and takes control, and that obviously then kind of drives forward the growth of America as a superpower.
In the late 50s, the sort of biblical epic dies out, but you've still got that hankering for big subjects, big epics, and so World War II kind of fills that vacuum in a really interesting way.
And now we're getting loads more films where people from Norway or Denmark or Sweden are able to tell their stories in a more kind of polished way.
The Italian tank, it's got 1 forward gear and 2 reverse. That's the old...
I don't think I've heard that one.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Echo Changer podcast with myself, Jacob.
And myself, Harley.
And today we're going to be covering something a little slightly different. We're going to stick to the kind of the theme that we've had on a few of our other episodes. Can't speak. I don't know what's going on.
We're just so excited.
So excited to get back to this podcast. But yeah, we had a couple episodes where we obviously focused on some different aspects of World War II, maybe some sort of angles that you might not have heard of.
Yeah.
We hope you haven't heard of them, because that's the point of the podcast. But yeah, today we're going to take it to the Scandinavian countries. We're going to be looking mostly at kind of the stories of resistance, kind of the perception of the Scandinavian countries during World War II, and just kind of how that perception's changed over time, and especially in the current day. And
some elements where other Allied powers were involved in things that maybe went a little bit wrong, or that they wanted to hush up, or hint, us.
It always comes back to us.
But I'm looking forward to learning about some of these things.
Yeah, amazing, and we're gonna have a very, very interesting discussion. I believe. I think it's very interesting,
as always.
And that's what it's all about.
Oh yeah,
that's what it's all about here. So yeah, I mean, well, I guess to start off with, I mean, it would actually be kind of interesting. Like, what's your understanding of how the Scandinavian countries' contribution to the war, or like their role in the war?
I suppose there's the kind of neutrality element that of Sweden. There's the element of the Danes rolling over pretty quickly, but they do manage something. I think I'm getting right here, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. They do manage, before they capitulate to the Nazis, to sort of spirit away their Jewish population to, I think, is it neutral Sweden? So that they are out of harm's way. So they do successfully do that. And then, of course, Norway is quite crucial in 1940, becomes occupied. You've got Quisling, the guy Quisling, where we get the word Quisling from. But yeah, beyond that, I wouldn't say I'm all that knowledgeable about the Scandinavian side of the war. So looking forward to learning more.
Yeah, for sure. Because obviously, I mean, you mentioned Denmark, and obviously, they famously sort of fell quite quickly. Which you could say is also not really their fault, given the fact that they had, as with pretty much every country in the lead up to World War II, we're dealing obviously with the aftermath of the Great Depression. Some countries recovered better than others, but Denmark itself was undergoing quite a period of economic turmoil in the lead up to the war. So obviously that impacts like defense spending, that impacts kind of organization, the stability of the government and things like that as well.
Of course, yeah.
And obviously, like geographically, Denmark's not an incredibly defensible territory, given that it's all flat. So pretty perfect territory, perfect terrain for German tanks,
like the Benelux countries.
Yeah. So Denmark, obviously, the theme with a lot of the Scandinavian countries, obviously, maybe discounting Sweden as they managed to remain neutral throughout the whole war, was the resistance movements. So obviously, we spoke about it in another episode about Finland and like the Winter War and the Continuation War. Maybe perhaps slightly different in the sense that they weren't necessarily an occupied country for like the majority of the war. They never actually fell. Rather they were forced to make a lot of concessions at different periods of time. Whereas obviously
shifted,
Whereas with the other Scandinavian countries like Denmark and Norway, they fell over a kind of period of time in the war as Germany was really starting to ramp up its escalation of the conflict. Just after they'd obviously invaded Czechoslovakia, they'd invaded Poland, and they were sort of going into like the Benelux countries as well. And Denmark and Norway fell pretty quickly after that. However, where I feel like this episode I really wanted to take us to, the level I wanted to take it to was more around the perception of these countries, because I feel like both of us, we live in the UK, we're both from the UK, and I feel like when you grow up in the UK and you have a very specific kind of education, I assume it would be very similar for America as well, or maybe perhaps even France potentially. But when we're talking about the Allied powers, we kind of really discount the countries that contributed, but maybe they weren't like, they were occupied throughout the war.
But I'd apply that also to Commonwealth countries too, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
I think we overlook the massive contribution from the Anzac forces. The British Indian forces were massively important, all sorts. So I think as is inevitable in big, complex, multifaceted conflicts, you're going to sort of focus on the big kind of primary players, maybe forgetting the subtle nuances of all the kind of what we might think of as smaller players, and what they're contributing, which actually may be and was of course very important.
I'm happy to hear you mention that. As someone who grew up in New Zealand, obviously the contribution of the Anzac forces and countries was immense.
I'd say I know less about that side of things in the Second World War than about the First World War, so that could be...
First World War was more well known, but I still feel like it's not... Gallipoli is the main kind of event, but I think even that in itself isn't necessarily like touched upon that much when we do remembrance.
No, it's true.
And it's such a big... And obviously, like, having lived over there, like it's a much bigger deal, obviously, for the sacrifice made to people to remember.
Well, I suppose it's the kind of sum of the Anzac forces, really. It's that moment, it's that sort of brutal moment where they just lose so many people.
I mean, it was brutal. It was just a meat grinder, pretty much. Like it was a really poorly,
and like Verdun for the French, it's the same kind of thing. Everybody has their big disaster, and I suppose Gallipoli would be the one for the Anzac troops.
So obviously, I think going back to the kind of original point of, history is written by the victors, and I think more specifically it's written by the specific victors that played the biggest part.
Completely.
And I think obviously, like, at the time you could still count the UK as a superpower. America was a rising superpower.
Those were the days pre-Suez.
Depending on how you look at it, of course. But we'll leave Empire for another episode, I think. As I know we have very different opinions on that one, so we'll see how that goes. So we look at, like, obviously, you think about pop culture and you think about the movies that are written about World War II, sort of stories that you see about it, and it's predominantly kind of from the American perspective, the British perspective, but mostly from like the soldier's perspective. And I do feel like the tide has changed a bit in the sense that lots of war movies, in maybe like the 60s, 70s, 80s also, may have been more oriented towards kind of like the glorification of it necessarily. Like, I'm not saying every single film, because obviously you have a lot of...
But also it's the time, it's the moment in the history of Hollywood, and maybe we should do something about the history of Hollywood itself, because it's fascinating. But the 60s and 70s, coming off the back of the 50s, where you have all the big biblical epics being made, there is this taste for massively lavish productions, kind of 3-hour epics, huge ensemble casts, and a very detailed, and when that lens is turned to memorialising the Second World War, you get films like what's it called? The Longest Yard. Not The Longest Yard.
That's a very different film.
That's a very different film. The Longest Day, in fact, based on the Cornelius Ryan book about D-Day, which is a gorgeous, gorgeous film, and very, very detailed. You get Patton is one of these films. A Bridge Too Far. All of these films are using every tool at the disposal of the filmmakers to recreate in on a massive scale, these big World War II battles. So it lends itself, as a subject, it lends itself to a Hollywood that's maybe becoming, in the 60s, it's becoming a bit more, you've got the Vietnam War, etc. You've got a public who's a little bit more cynical. People are probably less, well, and they are, because it dies out, I'd say, in the late 50s, the sort of biblical epic dies out, but you've still got that hankering for big subjects, big epics, and so World War II kind of fills that vacuum in a really interesting way.
Yeah, and I also think, I mean, kind of the topic, like the theme that I would touch upon is, the almost the glorification of war and the films where it's very like, shooty explosion.
But I think
we're
also
the heroes, we beat the bad guys. And
I think that's true up until the 60s, at which point
it kind of diverts a bit.
You get that slightly more as you get. I mean, this is pre New Hollywood's kind of late 60s, but you do have this slightly more kind of self-aware tone and less kind of one-dimensional glorification. So again, films like those that I mentioned are brilliant in that they give you the kind of ambivalence, especially Patton, I would say, is a huge one for that, with him kind of striding over the battlefield and looking at the dead American troops and reflecting on the kind of cost of war. You do get that kind of awareness coming in. But yeah, certainly kind of in the immediate aftermath, they're basically propaganda films. Those early war films.
And I think this is something that I might touch on a bit later as well. But almost the way that the war is looked back upon by the former Allied powers, whether that's Russia, America, UK, France as well. Like even Russia, they obviously refer to World War II as like the Great Patriotic War, and the framing of that is quite interesting because again, obviously they were invaded by, like, the Soviet Union was invaded by the Germans, and then they kind of had the perfect story of, I guess, pushing back the enemy and rallying and really
it's got echoes of Napoleon and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, so I think there's that aspect of it as well, and I think with Britain, like, it's not just the fighting aspect and the fact that we opposed fascism, those kind of things, but it's the resistance of it as well, because the whole of mainland Europe was essentially invaded and controlled and occupied by the Axis powers, to the point where we were the last like piece of Allied land,
last bastion of freedom and democracy,
and we were also at one point very close to losing the Battle of Britain.
Well, quite.
I mean, again, you can debate for hours the feasibility of Germany actually ever conducting a successful invasion.
Well,
of the UK.
as we discussed in the last episode or the last one before that, it just was never going to happen.
It never would have happened, and I will die on that hill.
They didn't have the naval capacity.
Well, the Royal Navy was just too good. What can you say?
Empire, isn't it?
Yeah, but yeah,
Britannia rules the waves.
Although they did.
Did. Is that alas?
We digress.
No, I'm being facetious now.
But yeah, sort of move back to the Scandinavian countries again. I think where I was kind of going with the film point was that when you look at the perception of the war on these different countries, I think we've been conditioned over a very long period of time, and I'm talking decades and decades, to only really see a few perspectives. And whether that's the American perspective, the British perspective, maybe the French one, that they fit the different archetypes, because with Britain, you have, the kind of, I guess, not global police, but like the good guy power who's like opposing fascism.
The benign overlord.
Sort of like the custodian kind of role.
Paternalism.
Yes.
Paternalism.
And you have the mixture of that, and then kind of, the stubbornness to give up, the real resistance against the Germans in the face of pretty overwhelming odds, and then being able to bounce back.
The kind of the sort of underdog story coming into it.
A lot of it owed to the fact that we are an island. So that geography does matter, as it did in Denmark as well, in the wrong way.
Yeah. Well, with us, it goes back to the Romans, doesn't it? Our kind of impenetrability as a, Caesar famously failed at first, and then, or rather didn't really fail, but decided it wasn't really worth his effort after a little recce. and it took a few more emperors until we got to one that really was able to come over in force.
And even then, they were too scared of the Scottish. So
to be fair, I mean, aren't we all? Aren't we all?
No comment.
Yeah.
But yeah, so like UK, you have that kind of, that's the perspective you have from the UK. France, you always have the resistance perspective, the kind of,
resistance.
Real like downtrodden underdog comes back, manages to really stick it to the Germans.
Yeah, you've got that thing. You've got that thing in France of if you sort of counted up everybody who said that their family was in the resistance, you'd have kind of more people than there were in France.
Yeah. But I mean, this is a separate topic that we might cover. But I also think the perception of France, because everyone makes the joke of like, they surrender like the drop of a hat, basically, or whatever. But it's like,
no, that's the Italians.
That's
the old joke, isn't it, about the Italian tank? It's got 1 forward gear and 2 reverse. That's the old.
I don't think I've heard that one.
Yeah, I think it relates. It relates to the sort of African, like Abyssinia and those sorts of things, where you've got pretty well armed Italian soldiers taking one look at the African warriors coming charging at them with spears and just telling tale and fleeing for mama and home.
I mean, Italy again. They didn't know what side they were on half the time. So
no, well, they're just deeply confused, really. Yeah.
But yeah, there's lots of things to dig into. As you can tell, we have a lot of topics to cover.
I've just been reading, funny enough, about the Republic of Salo and the kind of the last little holdouts in Italy in the north, right towards the end of the war. It's a fascinating story.
Yeah,
but one for another day, alas.
One for another day. But yeah, and I guess the last point would be the American perspective, where obviously, sleeping giant kind of wakes up and takes control, and that obviously then kind of drives forward the growth of America as a superpower that would set the tone for where we are today, really. But
Cold War and
but
that flip from isolationism to intervention.
Yeah,
it kind of turns on a dime, and Pearl Harbor, I suppose you could say,
was a catalyst.
Is that sort of moment? Yeah.
But I do think that based on those kind of 3 different perspectives, you can see how we almost cover all bases in terms of films that you could make. You can obviously you want to make something that's a bit different to a real your US beat comes over and they beat up the Nazis and just save the world and stuff. You might want a resistance film. Okay, we'll make one about the French or the British or something like that. You can cover all of those different perspectives with those 3 nations pretty much.
Yeah.
And maybe there'd be the odd film that would maybe touch upon maybe the the Italians or the Polish maybe or the Czechs perhaps, but you wouldn't, as a Westerner, you wouldn't really be likely to come across a mainstream version of that.
True. Yeah,
in a foreign language.
It's true. There's the famous Rossellini trilogy. I think he calls it is it Rome Open City, I think, is one of them. I can't remember what the trilogy itself is kind of called, but it's sort of if you're looking for kind of Italian film, an Italian set of films about the Italian experience in the Second World War, that is apparently Rossellini's trilogy. I think beginning with Rome Open City is the one to go for, because it's sort of just after the war. It's Italian neorealism. It's that whole thing of using real people with kind of raggedy worn faces and not worrying too much about them being brilliant actors, but just getting the kind of real
realism of it,
the kind of real grit of life in there. That's but other than that, I don't think I'm really aware. I mean, of course, you've got kind of Roberto Benigni's Life is Beautiful, the very sentimental, some would say kind of slightly whitewashing account of the Holocaust from the Italian perspective. But of course, Primo Levi, if you need a corrective to that, reading Primo Levi is a pretty stark contrast. But other than that, I'm not really aware of. Well, of course, you've got Pasolini. Speaking of the Republic of Salo, you've got Pasolini's Salo, the 120 Days of Sodom, which is a real journey of a watch. And if you've got the stomach for it, is brilliant. But and that deals with the kind of decadent final days of Italian fascism and the depravity that kind of takes off therein. But other than that, I'm not aware really of a big sort of corpus of film that deals with the Italian World War II experience in the same way that we and the Americans and indeed the French.
And I think that's the same case for all of the other countries that we were going to talk about. It's like, obviously Scandinavia, that's kind of the overarching topic here, but that point leads quite nicely into this, because I feel like it's obviously, people in every country make films in their own language, and they make those kind of films. Whether they make it to different markets is a whole other question.
You've got the whole, and then you've got the whole element of the kind of art house thing projected over it. There's only a certain amount that's going to make it into international distribution, and it may not be remotely quote unquote art house, but it gets shoved in with that.
Well, it's like at what point did foreign language films stop being like an indie thing in like Western society? I think it's we really neglect to, like, I think especially in the UK we're really guilty of it, is not being open to other perspectives from like other countries on stuff that happened around that period of time. I think because we have our own like entrenched view of how World War II played out, how the build up was, what war was like, and the aftermath and the consequences of everything. We're always, again, it's propaganda. Like in every country, it's propaganda. And you're always served a version of events that is going to be most favourable to the place that you're in. Like, I think it's...
Well, of course.
I think
nobody wants to go and pay their money and come out feeling...
Well, that didn't sell, does it?
Yeah, exactly.
But I think this is where it's important, and this is one of the reasons why I actually really love history, and something that I'm really passionate about, is I think understanding other perspectives throughout history, because I obviously, like, I'm quite curious about different parts of history, mostly like ancient world and stuff, but I will seek out different perspectives to try and find, I don't know, like, what was the experience of this faction, or is there a different version? There's a different source.
Yeah, you're going to see things from another angle.
And I always found it interesting when I did classical history at high school. We were learning about like Alexander the Great and stuff on like ancient
and
Rome
reenacting some of it in the playground.
Of it. But I found like it's you're finding different sources, and you always have like your kind of tier list of like reliable sources on certain things, whether that's someone who is like, they were best friends with the person and they were constantly documenting their life, or it was someone who was following them along. Yeah. But a lot of the time, they don't agree on anything. Like,
oh no,
if you actually
especially when you look at classical sources, I mean, like,
the thing is also they've been
they're all over the shop.
I mean, they're basically Chinese whispers at that point, because
and they're all written with an agenda, with an agenda for whoever they're writing for. I mean, Shakespeare's plays are written in a way that is complementary to the Tudor house, because he's writing for Elizabeth until of course it changes over to the Stuarts. So Richard III is a total, he's turned into a villain. Well, I mean, I think he probably was a villain, but he's not the kind of true kind of...
They're probably like portrayed in a certain way.
Yeah, he's not the kind of...
So essentially, like, what we can kind of take from it is that there are different sources for the different periods of history or whatever. But I think in recent years, especially, like I say, like by recent, I would say like 15, 20 years or so, there's been a rise in the amount of like foreign language World War II films that are available to us. And I think especially in recent years, I've noticed a lot more on platforms like Netflix. I think Netflix is really good for this as well. And I think they've done a lot of work generally to expand the film industries in other European countries, especially. But they pump so much money into the productions, and it brings the production value up. Yeah. Because again, I think where lots of people would associate kind of a Scandinavian film with like being like an indie.
Yeah, well, you think sort of Bergman, don't you?
It's not going to be like super high quality or something like that. Like it's not going to be like a Hollywood film or whatever.
Yeah, you think sort of Seventh Seal,
couple of actors. Yeah. So you immediately come at it from a different expectation. And I think where now we're getting loads more films where people from like, Norway or Denmark or Sweden are able to tell their stories more kind of, not necessarily more articulately because they were already articulate, but in a more kind of polished way, in a way that we digest. But I also think that when I watch like some of the films, like because I've watched a few of the different Scandinavian war films. So, like I watched one of the Norwegian ones called Number 24, which is all centered around a resistance agent in Norway who is one of the most famous resistance agents, and it kind of documents his journey through kind of, the start of the war with the occupation beginning, kind of lots of the operations that he had to be part of. There were multiple times when he was offered to be, taken to the UK to sort of conduct operations and stuff from the UK and the safety of it. But every single time he would sort of, he'd refuse, he'd be adamant, like, no, I want to stay, I want to be useful here. And it's a really moving film. I would highly recommend it. I think it shines a light on the resistance movement in Norway, and I think even though one of the other things, because when I was kind of doing a bit more research on the topic, just ahead of us talking about it, I always wondered, like, why isn't the story of Norway or Denmark taught more? And
I suppose it's just you can only teach so much stuff.
Well, you can only teach so much, but at the same time,
it's just not. Yeah,
I feel like we see certain countries it's almost like a side story.
Yeah.
As bad as that sounds, that's kind of the way
it's
viewed.
Completely.
Because when you consider...
Well, that's just life, isn't it, right? Like, you can only care about...
What's in your immediate...
You care about things in, like, concentric circles. So, like, you care in personal relationships, you care about your family, immediate family the most, then your friends, then, and it goes out and out and out. It's the same thing with national histories and whatnot. You're going to care most about the place that you're in. And then a little bit less, and unfortunately they fall in one of those outer concentric circles whereby we only have so much kind of space in the brain to process
absolutely.
stuff, and
I think that's like a completely like psychological kind of reasonable way of describing that, because that is the case. But I do think that we almost have to actively search out different perspectives.
Yes, I think it's true.
And where
the market doesn't naturally serve us up.
No,
these things you have to go looking for.
You have to go looking for it. But I think also is one of the interesting things that I did kind of find as I came across as I was looking up some bits about this topic, was that someone articulated it a lot better than I will right now, but they almost framed it as, we view Scandinavian theatre as almost a bit of a side story to the main war in Europe, because it didn't necessarily have a massive impact on the front lines.
You could sort of slice it out, and it wouldn't. Maybe that's wrong, but I don't know. But I feel like you could slice out the Scandinavian chapter, and it wouldn't really affect the broad strokes of what happens.
And I think I kind of broadly agree with that kind of theory. However, I would also, specifically in the case of Norway, because Norway is probably the kind of big example of really strong resistance movement, because even though they were occupied for a large portion of the war, they had a very comprehensive resistance network. They carried out numerous raids on kind of German infrastructure and troops in the country. There was a lot of civilian resistance to Nazi occupation. And also, like, at a certain stage of the war, the Germans were trying to develop heavy water in Norway as well, and there was...
Tell me about that. What's that?
So I'm not entirely clued up on the purpose of the heavy water, but I think it was something to do with weapons development or...
And heavy water, sorry, heavy water itself is what?
I'm pretty sure it's like a fuel of some kind. I need to...
So what it's like water, but it's denser sort of thing, it's heavier...
Right, we've got to fact check ourselves in real time here.
Yeah, let's do it. Sounds heavy. This sounds interesting.
Okay, yeah. So heavy water. It's a form of water where the hydrogen atoms are replaced by deuterium, an isotope of hydrogen that contains both a proton and a neutron. And for the non-physics brained people, including me, including all of us apparently here. So in simple terms, the heavy atoms make it denser than regular water and give it unique properties, such as it being used as a moderator in nuclear reactors. So obviously the Nazis did have a nuclear program.
So it's part of the lab.
But obviously,
interestingly, not radioactive.
No,
it's just a common misconception about it, because I think probably because of that.
Well, people associate anything with nuclear energy or weapons and anything with being radioactive.
They think it's going to be sort of glowing
a different case,
and has a higher boiling point.
But obviously because there's multiple ways that you can power like kind of nuclear reactions. I mean, even with nuclear power, for instance, like you could go with heavy water, or you could go with more kind of like graphite and different regulators to moderate, the reactions that you have within a reactor and stuff.
Yeah.
If you watch Chernobyl if you want to learn about any of that kind of stuff as well.
And to get back to that, because I got a bit stuck in Chernobyl. It was just all too bleak. But I'll give that a go.
It's an incredible series. But yeah,
no, very, very, very good.
But what I really want to look at next is the fact that we obviously look at like an occupied country and you think, oh, well, they just gave up. That's it. It's never that simple. And Norway was definitely like a real hotbed of resistance during the war. It's a very big country, so there's a lot to. As an occupying force, you also have to consider like the amount of time, resources, manpower that needs to be put in place to even hold the territory.
Well, quite. And they solved that in France by just saying, right, well, we'll focus on just occupying the northern half, and then we'll put in a sort of puppet regime under Marshal Pétain in the Vichy South.
Yeah.
And people say, sorry, quick tangent on that. People say in the old classic, what if the Nazis had successfully invaded Britain? Where would that point be? And some people, I think Andrew Roberts, if I'm not mistaken, in his kind of counterfactual essay about it, says that it would be kind of Yorkshire would be the kind of cut off, and or rather slightly lower, and then Harrogate would be the capital of the puppet regime in the north, whereas of course it would be reversed as to how it was in France. The south would be occupied. You'd have King Edward VIII back on the throne as the sort of Nazi king, with throwing his brother in jail and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But anyway, I digress. But it's always interesting to look at the kind of mechanics of occupation and where are those lines drawn.
Well, one thing that we are probably going to do at some point is maybe have an odd episode where we kind of theorize about like alternative history paths and how that we think that could have played out. So I think we can have endless amounts of fun on that one.
Oh yeah, completely. Counterfactual. I've got some, the one that always fascinates me is what if the South had won the Civil War in America?
Oh yeah.
That one is, because there's a thing called the Golden Circle, I won't drag us down in it now, but a sort of secret society that was looking to extend slavery through Central America, forming thus a sort of golden circle of land with the kind of Gulf in the middle. And then you've got the whole myths about Confederate gold and all that kind of stuff. But counterfactuals, absolutely.
It's a good time, and there's always, I think it's when you split things off. Obviously, you have butterfly effects and so many different things, but I also think there is a certain point where you can just have endless possibilities of where things can go.
Completely.
What happens if
this
person
also
gets the throne sooner, or this person doesn't get in charge?
And I think it's also, because there's the old sort of the idea of history that kind of stems out of the kind of Marxist school, that everything is sort of impersonal economic forces, and that it refutes it, or it seeks to refute the quote unquote great man theory of history, whereby, well, if it wasn't Napoleon, somebody else would have filled his shoes, or if it wasn't him. And actually, I think the best refutation to that argument, that everything would have happened exactly the same, and somebody else would have come along, and it's nothing to do with personalities, and it's all impersonal forces. The best refutation to that, I think, is counterfactuals, because as soon as you alter one little thing in even one person's life, such as a Hitler or a Napoleon or something, the whole of history changes. So you think, well, okay, if there's ever a proof of the fact that it really does come down to individuals, to personalities, to
well, it's also that things happen; they'll just happen differently, and it's like I mean, one of the popular kind of alternate history kind of topics for, like, say, like the Soviet Union is if, like, oh, what if Trotsky was in charge rather than Stalin?
Yeah, huge.
And how different were those kind of situations? It doesn't play out in the way that anyone thinks it will until you start unpacking it in a conversation and having a look through stuff. But this is very much a tangent. And we'll get back to topic.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because the communists do say, those who kind of, you've got Trotskyites and whatnot, they do say that his version of communism was very, very different to sort of Leninist communism and Stalinist, etc., etc. So it would be fascinating to see.
We'll have a good time with that one. But yeah, so I mean,
anyway, tell us more about.
So one of the interesting things that I think, I mean, going back to that kind of the point that because Norway was, by all accounts, quite an unmanageable occupation to have. There was a very high level of resistance, both civilian and organized resistance.
Yeah.
Obviously, the organized resistance was very much supported by the Allied powers, and there was very active coordination of attacks and raids on certain things. We obviously talked about the heavy water facilities as well. And there was very famous battles like Narvik as well was really pivotal.
Yeah.
But what I would say as well is Norway, because of the level of resistance and because of how it was, the Germans did have to put more troops in there to garrison things. They did have to have increased security around their key facilities. They had to allocate more experienced generals or strategists to the region to make sure that everything was being managed properly. And these are all things that have diverted away from the main fronts.
Yeah, completely.
So I don't for one second think that the extra forces that needed to garrison the Scandinavian countries would have made the difference on those other fronts.
But it's interesting.
But it's like, how many fires do you have to put out as a country? Like, you're trying to fight on two fronts. Again, stupid decision. But then you've also got active occupations in multiple different countries with high levels of resistance. How do you manage those at the same time with the same amount of efficiency that you need to make sure you're not being distracted too much? But it is a real story. When we look at Norway as a specific example, we always we go back to the point of we think of occupation and you think they surrendered, they gave up. Because again, I think that's it's a kind of a false pretense that has been set by almost again, when we talk about the French, that they have a stereotype about it's always surrendering, waving the white flag or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's not the case. The very, very staunch resistance that they put up, and it's heroic. There's definitely there's nothing embarrassing about any of that. But but we kind of then because that's kind of what's propagated in movies or culture. And stuff that we kind of then associate that with every other country that was occupied.
I think just a quick thing on that. If anyone's interested in, as I hope you will be, in the occupation of France and the resistance and all the rest of it, I think it's Marcel Ophuls. I always mix them up. I think they're brothers, Max and Marcel Ophuls. I think it's Marcel Ophuls. That's Ophuls. Made this incredible film called The Sorrow and the Pity, which is 4 hours. It's a documentary. It interviews Nazis, ex-Nazis. It interviews sort of French farmers from the resistance. It interviews collaborators. It interviews kind of everybody in the. It even interviews Anthony Eden, who shows off his sort of French, his fluency in French by he's interviewed in French and responds very fluently in French. Again, with that kind of funny kind of upper class English twist that always sounds kind of funny when you hear it, when you hear someone speaking French with it. But fascinating film and really worth a watch. The Sorrow and the Pity. Yeah, go and check it out.
But yeah, I also think, I mean, this is actually something. This is an interest, maybe something that would be interesting for us to discuss. But I think, to what extent do you think? Maybe not this. I wouldn't say the suppression of the stories of not lesser countries, smaller countries in the war. How much of an impact do you think that, I don't know, the dominance of, say, American culture or British culture have on the telling of those stories?
Oh, it's huge.
Because the implication of some of the things that happened. I mean, an example I could get. So there's another really great film on Netflix called The Bombardment, and that's all around. It's a Danish film, and it's about a kind of failed bombing raid.
Yes, I was going to ask you about this.
Yes, so it's just a quick summary. I won't spoil the film because it's fantastic to watch. But it's based on a failed bombing raid on the SS headquarters in Copenhagen. To sort of there was lots of captured resistance operatives by the SS, and they were all being held in the headquarters in Copenhagen, obviously to be interrogated and then killed. And the resistance leaders coordinated with the British, kind of accepted, that we'd need to, have to bomb the building and stop anyone from talking because there's a chance that they would, which would put more people in jeopardy. So organised a bombing raid, but they organised a bombing raid, and instead of bombing the headquarters, they bomb a church with a bunch of nuns and orphans in it.
Oh dear.
And that's not good for optics, no matter which way you look at it. So,
we're implicated in that, aren't we?
And we are implicated in that. And the thing
was it the RAF that was?
Well, it would have been. But at the same time, I think with large, it's a global war. There's always accidents. There are always things that happen.
Things go wrong.
But the different, but what sets different countries or people apart is the ability to acknowledge things that happened that weren't good, that were really terrible, and to own it, apologize, pay whatever reparation you need to pay, but at least acknowledge it. And I think that's another theme where we can delve into around the Cold War, which I think, the more I look into it, the less faith in humanity I have, to be honest.
Oh well,
where when you realise the scale of things that were covered up by the Allies post World War II, in terms of using Nazi research that they performed on people in camps, the
complete American reliance on Nazi scientists,
also the complete kind
of in fighting communist elements during the Red Scare, during the McCarthyite years, the CIA is massively keen on allowing in ex-Nazis because who are the best anti-communists? The fascists.
But also it's the complete kind of, not necessarily exoneration, but letting off the hook of Japanese military scientists who committed even worse atrocities in some cases than the Germans, and they never saw a trial or any consequence. And
again, it's real.
Walk away with the research.
It's realpolitik, isn't it? It's that thing of we got through it now, we're on the other side. Do we really want to spend the rest of our lives relitigating everything, or do we just move on for the sake of this, that, the other? And of course that means, justice often suffers as a consequence. I think,
which again, I think is I think it's also sad in the sense that not just because those stories go untold, but also because we have all lots of us have grown up in a country and a world where we're told a specific set of facts about that period of time, and it's always you have to see it from the patriotic perspective. You have to look at it and you're proud. You feel great about your country and things. And don't get me wrong, I do feel that when you hear of some of the acts of heroism. My granddad was a radar operator in World War II. Came over from Jamaica.
Yeah, and broke a sort of colour boundary there as well. In a really important way.
And he, there's so many stories of heroism, and we have to be eternally grateful for the sacrifice that people made.
Yeah.
So that we shouldn't have to do that ever again.
Yeah. It's finding that nuance, isn't it? I know what you're saying. It's how do we maintain pride in ourselves without feeling a kind of cognitive dissonance about also acknowledging that wrong takes place, because you can't sort of there are some people for whom you cannot have both. You cannot have both the good and the bad. It has to be black and white. It has to be, we were good, and that's the rest of it. Yada yada.
And that's the thing, because I think when that starts getting conflated with the idea of patriotism, and I mean, historically also a lot of the kind of not revisionism, but the kind of modern critique of some of the stuff that happened in World War II comes predominantly from people maybe on the left of the political spectrum. It's then drawn into a question of you're not patriotic enough. You don't love your country.
And the best refutation to all of that is George Orwell. He is the example of a left-wing British patriot.
Yeah, he
is totally able to say, I am proud to be British, but I can also hold left-wing beliefs and believe in reform and all the rest of it.
And I do think we should have. I mean, my biggest belief is that we should all have the facts. We should always have all the facts. I mean, at our disposal, because when you're teaching somebody about a period of history, we're going to have many moments on the podcast where one of us will be telling the other about something we don't have that much knowledge about.
Yeah, of course.
But you're relying on somebody to give you enough information that you can come to a conclusion. It's
trust,
and you want to have that trust. And I think I've always been fascinated by the world wars, but as I've kind of gotten older, I really find the accounts lacking half the time, because I want to understand the different perspectives of the war. I want to understand, okay, obviously we always call it, World War II. We only ever talk about a few countries.
Yeah.
So it's like there's so many more countries were impacted by this conflict.
Yeah.
And in some cases maybe still continue to be impacted by the geopolitical consequences of it. But we never saw so many perspectives. I think that's a bit crazy.
Yeah, and I think that comes down to human nature being what it is. One is only going to admit fault where one is absolutely forced to. So I think the classic fault line here is Germany and Austria. They have completely different understandings of what happened. Germany, as the perpetrators of the Holocaust, have to look at themselves and go, oh my God, what was that? That was horrible. That can never happen again. And the whole of German politics, I mean, you could talk about, Merkel's policy around the refugee crisis in 2015 and letting in people. It was is all built into the German psyche of we are making up for the atrocious crimes that were committed. Whereas Austria still has to this day a very, very ambivalent
they kind of hide behind the
we were occupied.
We got annexed.
Whoa, hang a minute! I've seen those pictures of Hitler rolling into Vienna, and you didn't look very sad about it.
And you agreed.
Yeah, you didn't look terribly torn up about it.
Yeah.
But no, it's true, and in the Jewish Museum in Vienna, they have this whole thing about, guys, we Austrians were very much implicated, and then you've got the classic story of The Sound of Music is it's banned for however many years. I can't remember when it was sort of unbanned, but it was sort of shockingly recently in Austria that you could actually show The Sound of Music simply because it points up the fact that there were actual Nazis in Austria.
Yeah,
imagine that. Yeah, not just everybody kind of Again, the sort of myths about resistance and about occupation and all that.
And it's something that I actually wonder, is maybe posing a little bit of a bigger question. It's with the rise of us being given more perspectives through films or TV shows, accounts of history from other places. Does that have an impact on kind of the policy of countries like the US or the UK on how we recall that period of time? Because it's very hard for us to just deny it if it's out there.
True. If the popular consciousness is again, it comes back. We're talking about cynicism, about self-awareness, about people being more savvy as the years go on.
Yeah,
and it's more and more difficult. I would postulate it would be more and more difficult for a particular state to tell its people a particular story about the past if the people in that state were quite obviously coming to terms with and becoming aware of the complexities of the period and making films about it and reflecting on it in the general discourse, not just in the academy, because stuff in the academy kind of gets forgotten about largely because it's locked away in its own sort of ivory tower. But if the general popular discourse is such that it is unignorable, then it becomes quite difficult for a sort of government for a particular I don't want to say regime because that has implications, but for any sort of ruling authority to continue to propagate a sort of black and white narrative.
And I think also in the context of the world we live in today, where obviously there's a lot of tension around the world of the different conflicts. There's lots of conflicts happening in the world. I also think how it doesn't really serve a lot of governments to allow that kind of narrative to be built about kind of the war and looking back at the world wars as what they were, which is inherently horrendous and terrible.
Yeah.
Rather than, because I think the other issue is that when it starts getting conflated purely with patriotism, it's seen as it's seen as a glorious endeavor in the same way that it was pitched to people in World War One. it's like, oh, you go fight for your country, you're
back
gonna
in
get lots
time
of
for
glory,
Christmas,
back in time for Christmas.
All the girls will love you.
Yeah, exactly. And all this,
and
then it's like, well, the reality.
And you don't want, and also it's the carrot and the stick, isn't it? It's the if you don't go,
then it's worse.
The girls are going to come with their white feather in a very public way and embarrass you and say, look, and give you the white feather and imply you are a coward. And that is the truth. I mean, there's a great film, The Four Feathers, which is not this period, it's earlier. It's Britain colonial Britain in Africa in the years leading up to Khartoum and General Gordon. It's an episode prior to that, but it's in that kind of general area, and it is this great classic story of a man who refuses to fight. And then is given the feather, and it just ruins his life. It completely, he falls apart, and it's a kind of redemption story from there. Beautiful film from the 30s, I think, or 50s, with Ralph Richardson. Yeah. In a really good role.
But yeah, but I do think as well, like it's like in terms of today's interests and obviously like we say with rising tensions and stuff like that. There's obviously like a vested interest in having people being at least somewhat willing to fight for their country and stuff. But the issue is obviously compared to back then, we have an unlimited amount of information.
But then also,
especially in the context of having an actual conflict in Europe happening, where there's an insane amount of documentation. Like you go on, I mean, people post like videos on Twitter of like them on the front line. In Ukraine,
which is why it makes it.
There's so many first-hand
Speaking of Ukraine and Russia, which is why it makes it even more remarkable when you get these stories of sort of 18-year-old Russian kids who turn up to the front line thinking that they're liberating the Ukrainian people from some sort of Nazi regime.
The rhetoric around everything is
it's extraordinary because it's like we do live in the most media savvy age, and I don't think.
Also, I would challenge that not in the sense that I don't agree with you, but like I wouldn't even say necessarily media savvy. I think it's just like brain rotted phase of like knowledge, because there's so much disinformation that's going
that's
on.
true, and people cease to be able to work out what's true and what's not, and fake news and all that kind of stuff. But correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think the Russians like the Chinese, obviously your internet is controlled, it's a closed circuit kind of thing, you're not able to get, and that's why when all the gangs over here are nicking your phones in the streets of London, that they get sent to China and sold on for a massive profit because they want your access to global internet. Now, I don't think it's the case that in Russia they have the same thing, and yet
they censor quite a lot. Like,
is there a fair amount?
There's a fair amount of censorship on like social media, and
because you do also have that difference, don't you? They say in the generations in Russia, if you're of the older generation, you watch RT, Russia Today. That is your source of information, and so you're getting a kind of massively skewed version of things. Whereas the younger generation are saying, "Grandma, what are you talking about? We're not denazifying Ukraine. What are you on about? This is So you do get that dialogue a little bit more, I think.
Yeah.
But then again, it's sort of remarkable in that case that you do get these kind of Russian conscripts who are just completely confused and demoralised and don't really understand why they're there.
It happens. It happens the exact same way as it did back then, like in the World Wars, where maybe it's the soldier being told, "Oh yeah, you're going to liberate this country," like they really want us there, and they go there and they realise, "Oh wait, actually, what the people don't like us." Like, what's happening? Like, that's what I was told.
There's the difference in media, isn't there? That back then it's sort of British pathé if you're
given a very specific
and you're given your sort of dose of propaganda in the cinema before, and the newspapers are highly controlled as to what they're giving you, whereas you do have this kind of strange thing in Russia today, no pun intended, where you do have these two kind of conflicting elements of, well, the information is out there, and whether, as you say, there may be censorship and whatnot, but it's difficult to imagine young Russian kids not kind of finding out things in a way that young Brits back when we were being conscripted wouldn't have been able to. So you do get that interesting kind of
the split
dichotomy there.
Well, I mean, just to wrap it up, I guess, I think it's important to highlight these kind of lesser known stories. And I mean, that's kind of what our podcast is about. Is going over kind of lesser known history and things that people wouldn't have learnt about and stuff. But I think, especially in the context of today's world, when you learn about perspectives like, you know, some of the occupied countries or Scandinavian countries or even like some of the other European countries that maybe were just kind of just swept up as in part of the wars and stuff, it can give you so much context onto like, you know, why the world is the way it is today. And also like the vested interest. I mean, again, we can talk about media and propaganda and things like that, but we're sometimes hesitant to use the word propaganda when we talk about our own country and our own government.
Oh, we did it, yeah.
And every government everywhere does propaganda.
Right?
Like that doesn't change in every country.
You got to at that point you've got to win, right? You've got to win. So how do you win? Well, you've got to G up your forces.
You've got to whip up the mob. That's what you do.
It's just pragmatic.
But I do think like I'm personally very happy that there is more media coming out from countries like in Scandinavia
and
or even
Netflix
the
is
Baltics.
Netflix is a great way of doing that because it's a sort of polyglot forum
accessible
in which and I think also we are as a sort of audience becoming more able to digest foreign language content than perhaps we were maybe
it's
10,
more
20 or 30 years
consumed.
ago. You know, I mean, there's still plenty of people. You know, you'll sit down and you want to sort of watch a.
I don't want to look at any subtitles.
Well, that's the thing. That's the thing, isn't it? You get the kind of, it happens in anime. You know, you get the kind of fight between the sort of dubbed and the subbed. And I'm on the sort of subbed. I'm always
subbed all the way, man.
Well, but I also think more than just the language itself. It's in terms of being able to take in the information. I think you're just missing. So there's so much sort of music in listening to a foreign language and the cadences of it and how it works.
You get the mannerisms.
I love Korean cinema and listening to the Korean language is beautiful to listen to. It's fascinating. It's got a very different cadence to sort of Japanese or Chinese, and I think you're just missing so much. Not only are you kind of completely mutilating the sort of meaning because you've got some sort of underpaid sort of voice actor who can't be asked doing what.
Well, also, I think when you're doing dubbing, like you run into the problem of there not being a direct translation for the exact like thing they're trying to convey.
Yeah, and you often get it sort of written. You know, you'll hear.
It sounds corny as hell.
Yeah, when you're scrolling through stuff on Netflix and you'll scroll over something that looks interesting, but of course in the trailer they're giving you the dubbed bit. And it's this kind of weird, like it's almost like you've gone back like 40 years to sort of 80s.
Sounds like AI.
Sort of 80s Hollywood kind of, and you're like, what is?
It's like, what am I listening to?
What is that? Yeah, exactly. So but to go back to the point that we were making, I think Netflix has kind of democratized that arena whereby different countries can tell their different historical stories. There's that great one, The Empress, which tells the story of Empress Sisi, the Austro-Hungarian Empress, and that's German language, and it's absolutely brilliant and ravishing and amazing. And it's difficult to see some of these stories being told without that ability for you know, like the recent the Gabriel Garcia Marquez adaptation of 100 Years of Solitude. It's difficult to see that being done in an English language context without that sort of democratized
and I also think, like, you know, you get films. I mean, I never thought I would have come across it, but there was a film, the name escapes me, I'll try and find it at some point, but is a Lithuanian film all about kind of civilian deportations to, you know, Far East Soviet Union,
Gulag,
during, you know, the Soviet occupation, and you know, no one here knows anything about that. I didn't know anything about that, and I think again it's like we
again it's
you have the superpowers who tell the story, but any kind of criticism of those, I mean, obviously Soviet Union, it has its own history with like censorship and all those kind of things, so we can't expect it almost. But the fact that these stories can be told now, it gives, well, not only gives power to the people that it happened to, it allows stories to be told from people who deserve to have their story told, and it gives all of us a new perspective on events that happened, and maybe it gives us a new outlook on how we viewed that period of time.
And I think something that the sort of the Gulag suffers from is being overshadowed by the Nazi concentration camps, and I think we're in our brains we only have so much. We've got this little sort of pocket for sort of horror, and okay, we can only comprehend so much appallingness.
Which is psychological.
Yeah, psychological. You can only do so much, and so I think in the context of World War II, the Holocaust takes up that entire space, and rightly so. It is the ultimate crime against humanity.
And I do,
but that means that things like the story of deportations to the Gulag and sort of Solzhenitsyn, the Gulag Archipelago, all this kind of stuff, it does rather get kind of left behind because there's only so much.
Which is where I think it's important, because we all heard the different, the main kind of talking points about the war. And the mainline perspectives, like the Holocaust and some of the other atrocities that happened, like the concentration camps, the Japanese atrocities on war, like prisoners of war, all those kind of things. We're told those things all the time. We're now in a position where people have access to see all these other perspectives that would actually have a good chance of reforming how someone views that period of time. And I think that's, again, it all comes back to people should have the access to information to draw their own conclusions.
But also, you get that the real time element of like atrocities. Now we were talking about, and we're going to cover this in another episode.
We're going to have to cut this off, I think.
But merely the point I'm just to briefly make there is the if you are able to see atrocity happening in real time, it is very difficult for that story to be ignored or to not be told when. It's like we all saw it, we all know it's happening, kind of thing. Whereas, with the Second World War, it's like you have to hear about these things, or a lot of it's not committed to film, so you have to sort of. So then the story can be, and the Holocaust deniers have always operated in a kind of sphere of, because the Nazis were able to destroy so much evidence. You get people like David Irving, another great film, Denial, with Timothy Spall playing David Irving. You get that a little space is opened up for those people to crawl into.
Well, I think it also that point is amplified by the fact that we are getting to the kind of point now where lots of like living survivors and veterans of like World War II are passing away.
Yes.
So as World War II kind of fades out of living memory, it then gives rise to the kind of ugly denialist elements of people who are just like determined to push their own narrative.
And I think we're only going to see more of that.
But that's why I think it's important that we do talk about history and we do remember things and we do bring up the stories of people who should be remembered and stuff.
Of course.
Because otherwise we're going to let all those crazy weirdos dictate the narrative, and we don't need that. So
kind of that.
So yeah, on that note,
weird guys on podcasts. Telling you your history, don't do it. It's a bad idea.
But yes, on that note, we're going to wrap it up there. But yeah, thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.
Thank you.
How could the world have let this happen back then? And the reality is that it's been happening many times since.
There is no overarching moral imperative that will always win out. There is a complex array of factors, and amongst those factors, the moral element is a sort of.
It's pretty low in the
It's kind of pretty low down the pecking order. So.
Russia is still trying to act like they're a superpower. But they had an alcoholic in charge, and Boris Yeltsin didn't know what day it was half the time.
Quite. But she becomes very disillusioned with being in government in a kind of advisory capacity because she feels like, why am I here? I'm telling them all of this stuff. I thought they wanted to hear this.
This guy's committed genocide against his people, and he's a terrible, terrible guy, and he needs to go.
Yeah,
but you've still normalized.
It's all right. It's all right. Well, in a decade's time, we'll make up a kind of false pretense to come in, and we'll take him out there. Well, right now, we'll just kind of.